think, because most of this stuff is new. So let's get going. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, it's roughly three things. One is when we started SharePoint 15, we did a bunch of focus groups around hybrid. So I ran those, and I spoke with solution architects, I spoke with customers, I spoke with system integrators, I spoke with a lot of different people. And we wanted to find out what problems we should solve in this space. And so the first section, the journey to the cloud, that just gives a kind of summary of what we've heard. And that's shaped the way we think about the space and the solution that we delivered. So that's the first section. The second section is really about the specific scenarios and the design goals and the design that we came up with. So the high-level design and a lot of tricky issues that we had to work through, and I'm going to talk about that. And then the third large block of this talk is just about scenarios and demos. So there's a lot of those, so that whole section at the bottom, configuring this, configuring that, is primarily demo-driven. Okay? So hopefully that's what you guys came to hear. And let's start with the first one, journey to the cloud. So when we had the focus groups, it was pretty clear that everybody loves the idea, the concept of the cloud. It resonates very well. If you separate the actual concept of the cloud from the current reality of what enterprises have, if you take out the reality aspect and you say, okay, this is the pie in the sky, literally the sky in the cloud, it's clear that the idea resonates because it's cheaper than running IT systems yourself. You always have the latest, greatest tools. Customers can then focus on their business and not necessarily around needing to know, how Exchange is configured and all of that other stuff that's not core. A lot of times, given that we're building the servers and building the systems, we can actually host those services in the cloud more reliably and more efficiently than a customer can. We can scale them up with more elastic, things that we've made a lot of investment in, but customers typically don't have that infrastructure. And then once stuff is in the cloud, it's much more easier to collaborate. It's much easier to send a link to something if you know that's not sitting behind a firewall. Now, this is like motherhood and apple pie. Everybody gets this. So what's the problem? The problem is that everything is on-premises today. Everybody here has existing investments that are sitting on premises. This could be data, it could be content, it could be business applications, legacy systems, you name it. It's all sitting on premises. And face it, the cloud, it's come a long way, but it's not yet fully capable of what can be done on premises. There are gaps. The gaps are not as much as they were even a year ago when we came for SharePoint conference for last year, but there are still some gaps. And this thing came up a lot, and it's driven by two things. When we spoke to folks, depending on certain geographies and certain industries, there are times when customers don't want to move stuff into the cloud because they have compliance or regulatory issues or competition. There's just some stuff that's sensitive that they don't want out there. So this is the thing that they've struggled with, is how do we get the benefits of the cloud without being bogged down by all these other ground realities. Now, what I'm going to talk about in this session is a way that we think can be used to get the benefits of the cloud, but not have to give up on-premises for those cases where it makes sense not to move some of your stuff off on-premises and all into the cloud. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the session. Now, moving to the cloud. So recently, a couple of months ago, I actually moved countries. I relocated from one country and moved to the US. And when I did that, I had to take care of a lot of logistics. It wasn't easy. It was, getting movers, getting packers, getting shippers, all of that. And moving to the cloud is just like that. It's a big deal. Just thinking of the cloud as a destination is a small part of the problem. You have to think about the logistics of getting there. And how you get there, what moves there, when do you move it, all those are very tricky questions. And the thing that hybrid lets you do is it gives you some relief on the second part, the when to move. Now, I'm not going to drill too much into these questions. We had a couple of other sessions that talked about these, and for those folks who weren't at those sessions, you can certainly get that content. But in terms of the when to move, we've seen that customers do kind of three different things. So the first is there's some companies who are early adopters, and they try to move everything into the cloud. And honestly, there's large parts of Microsoft IT that are in this bucket. So we've aggressively moved our stuff into the cloud, and a lot of things like our whole SharePoint farm across the company is now in the cloud. And that's made things great for us because when I came here to Vegas to work on my presentations, I had all my decks, all my content just sitting there, accessible to me, and I didn't have to poke through a firewall or anything like that. But that's just that's not true for everybody. So not everybody can be an early adopter or wants to be an early adopter once or makes sense. And there's some companies that are just simply risk averse that are trying things out. They want to see what ROI they get, and based on that, they'll make the right decisions that are right for their business. And a third approach is where companies start de-emphasizing investments on premises. They say, you know what, we'll stop building stuff out here, and any new investment, or the majority of new investment, is made in the cloud. So we see these three different approaches, and all of these kind of talk to the aspect of timing. So as I said, moving to the cloud is tricky, the logistics are hard, and you have to decide when to do it. Now what hybrid scenarios gives you some relief on is it helps you slow down the transition. So you don't have to move as fast as you want, as you need to, in order to get the benefits. What it does is it creates a bridge or an on-ramp to the cloud that lets you park some of your stuff on premises and yet move into the cloud. And we'll talk about what can move first and what stays behind, and what we heard from customers. Now, at SPC, we have 4 sets of talks about hybrid. So there's an overview session that Brad presented yesterday, and then Brad also presented a session on search, on hybrid search, and how to get search results from the cloud that cover your on-premises systems. That's one aspect of hybrid that I'm not going to talk about in this session. What I'm going to talk about is a large chunk of scenarios that we also enable beyond search, which was about connectivity, and specifically how to connect SharePoint Online to on-premises data for apps and other kinds of scenarios. And also I'm going to talk specifically about Duet, which is the special case where SharePoint Online is connected to an on-premises SAP system. I'm going to talk about the Duet case for 2 reasons. One is generally to give information on the Duet offer that's available in SharePoint Online. But the second reason I'm going to do it is because Duet Online is a great example of the kinds of scenarios and the kinds of engineering problems and the kinds of challenges that a customer might face in moving content and data into the cloud, whether that's SAP or whether that's something else. So that was the first section of my talk, which is just some background. And I will come to the second section, which I'll cover the scenarios in more detail, and also talk about some of the design thinking that went into the hybrid space, what our design goals were, what is the high-level design that we came out with, so that you can appreciate the solutions when you present them. Now, at a very basic level, when you look at the scenarios, when we started out in SharePoint for this release, we actually made a list of scenarios that could be made hybrid across all the different workloads in SharePoint, and we came up with a list of 108 scenarios. Those are a lot. There were scenarios in search, there were scenarios in business connectivity, there were scenarios in ECM, enterprise content management, social, all of that. But fundamentally, all of those scenarios fell in 2 groups. One where SharePoint Online was calling on-premises, and one where on-premises was calling SharePoint Online. And it turns out that although there's over 100 different scenarios, that the kind of hard engineering problems you have to solve were mostly dictated by which of these two categories you fell in. And so this becomes a very useful distinction for us. And so when we actually start drilling into the design, you'll see that the designs that I present are going to map to one of these two things, and I'll talk about it in that context. And so to get a little more specific, the scenarios I'm going to talk about in today's talk are around BCS inside SharePoint Online and Duet Online. And for BCS, I'm going to talk about two scenarios. One where SharePoint Online is pulling data from on-premises, so that's the direction of SharePoint Online making a call to an on-premises system and getting something back. And for BCS, the second scenario is in the other direction, where somebody is sending a notification to SharePoint Online, and that's through the new BCS eventing channel that we added in this release. And that's in the reverse direction. So that's the two BCS scenarios at a high level. And for Duet, Duet has the same scenarios as BCS because it's built on top of BCS. So we'll show specifically for the case when the on-premises system is SAP, what the BCS scenarios become and how they change or at least are configured slightly differently. And then beyond that, we'll also talk about a few other scenarios, such as taking a report from an on-premises system and delivering that into SharePoint Online, taking a task and using that to trigger off a workflow in SharePoint Online, and finally, about taking roles that are sitting in SAP and are then sent across to SharePoint Online as synced to SharePoint Online, and then you can use those roles inside SPO to basically set permissions on securable content and securable objects. So those are the kind of high-level scenarios that we're going to talk about in this session. And for each of these scenarios, I'm going to talk about a design and do a demo. Now, kind of the first question is it even possible to access data across these hosting boundaries and be able to source these kinds of apps in different locations and do that in a safe and secure manner? Well, the answer to that question had better be yes, because if not, then we're all sitting in this room and discussing something that doesn't make sense, and we can just get up and go right now. So fortunately, that answer is yes. But the issues that you need to solve are around connectivity and security. The connectivity issue is pretty basic. It's that if you're trying to call from the cloud to an on-premises system, you can't normally go through the firewall. So that's the point of the firewall. It blocks access from the outside. And so we need a way for an admin to bless or configure certain kinds of access so that SharePoint Online has a channel into an on-premises system. So that's the connectivity problem that we had to solve, enabling that channel or that safe and secure passage. And the second one is about security. There's multiple kinds of security issues that come up here. It's, first of all, if SharePoint Online is calling down to your on-premises systems, you first need to verify that the calls are in fact originating from SharePoint Online, because anybody could be spoofing your tenancy in the cloud, and we want to make sure that there's a way that you can say, no, this tenancy in SPO is what I trust, and all of these other guys who are pretending to be SharePoint Online, these are, I want to block those. So that's the first level of security. The second level of security is between SharePoint Online and on-premises systems. It turns out that your identity in the cloud is different from on-premises. I'll talk about that. Your access rights are different. Your permissions are different. Your credentials are different. And all of that fall into that second category of security. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the forward flow, which is from SharePoint Online to on-premises. That's what we call the forward flow. And I'm going to drill into that. And as part of that drilling, we'll basically understand these issues better and then come up with a design. So I'm going to show you a scenario, because what we found talking about this problem is that it's okay, I'll say it's insanely complicated, and it's hard to grasp. So we found that it helps people if we put it in a picture and then walk through all the issues at the different points. So let's say that you're a company, Contoso, and you have on-premises data, and it's sitting behind your internet firewall. So that's what you have today. And then after that, you activate, you first of all, somebody checks out Office 365, signs up, gets a subscription, creates a tenancy, and now you're rolling in the cloud. So that's step one, your first baby step into the cloud. But if you do that, the thing that you'll want to do is you want to put apps into your tenancy. You want to have your business applications in SharePoint Online, and those need to be connected to your data on premises. So the question is, how do you establish that connection? Now, let's say that the first thing that a tenant admin might do is he might say, hey, I need this connection. Let's make holes in the firewall, and if we make enough holes, then data will flow. It's like build it, and they'll come just like that. Make holes, and everything is good. But network folks are not going to accept that. If you look at IT, and we talked to a bunch of folks in IT, we found that they were divided roughly into two groups. One is the folks who manage the network and own the network engineering teams. And the second set of people are the applications folks, the applications groups in IT. And they're very different. In fact, to us, it was surprising how different these two groups were. They're like separate tribes in some sense. The networking guys are very risk-averse. Things move slower. They know that if they make a mistake, they can, they can leave the vaults of information that they're trying to safeguard. They can leave those unprotected. So they move very slowly, and they're very risk-averse. The apps guys move a lot quicker, and they want a lot more done because they're being paid to get business solutions up and going. And so this friction between networking and applications is front and central to hybrid. So given that this typically is not an option, let's say what the second step might be. You might consider, okay, you know what? We'll start moving our services, our data, into the DMZ, or the perimeter network. People call this by different names, but the perimeter network or the DMZ for demilitarized zone is a common phrase. But if you do that, then the thinking might be that then these endpoints become internet accessible, and so now SharePoint Online can call these. But IT management is going to shoot that down pretty fast because it's got all kinds of bad security implications. You don't want to have all of your important data sitting there on the DMZ, accessible to anybody over the net. And so what we wanted to do was come up with a solution for hybrid BCS, and I'll talk about what that is. And the problems that this needs to solve are, in addition to creating a secure and safe channel through the firewall, it also needs to solve a couple of other things. One is the identity transformation problem. When you log in, if for folks who've actually logged into Office 365, you go to tenancy and you log in, you're logging in with your cloud credentials. So for me, when I do that, it will typically be arthanubi@microsoft.com. But on premises, I'm different. I'm Redmond/Arthanubi, so that's my domain credentials. Now, a mapping does exist, and IT does know about that mapping. But when we make the call from SharePoint Online down to the on-premises system, we need to make sure that mapping gets applied so that users are known in both environments. So now, beyond the identity mapping problem, I also need to solve the identity federation problem, or the authentication problem, because the set of data that I'm connecting to on-premises may have a variety of different credentials or authentication schemes. Some might use basic authentication, where a username, password is there. Some might use Windows integrated credentials. Some might use OAuth. There's a variety of things. Sometimes those credentials might be group credentials, so everybody accessing the application uses the same credentials, or other cases, those may be per user credentials, where everybody has their own credentials to get in. And so we need to kind of solve all of those authentication problems. So we need to answer the question, how do I authenticate to all of these on-premises systems? And also, fundamental to all of this is the idea, the concept of trust. How do I make sure that SharePoint Online is trusted on-premises? How do I make sure that wherever I'm storing these credentials or managing the authentication, I trust that location? So one of the things we heard loud and clear when we did the focus groups was that customers were very, very resistant to the idea of having credentials stored in the cloud. That was something that we took as a design goal from the first day, that we wouldn't actually store any credentials to an on-premises system in the cloud, because that was something that customers weren't just not willing to do. So we need to solve that in a way where the credentials and the connections and all of that, the permissions, all of that is stored on-premises, and the cloud has a way to get to that when it needs to. So now that we've talked about the problems, let's talk about what the solution looks like. So at a very high level, what we've done is we've taken the BCS stack. BCS stands for Business Connectivity Services. It's a way for SharePoint to connect to external data. We've taken that and we've moved that into the cloud. So now BCS, which was in SharePoint 2010, only on premises, we moved it into the cloud. We did that about a year ago. And over the last year, we've extended that so that BCS in the cloud, in SharePoint Online, can make a call to an on-premises system, and that on-premises system has to be fronted by SharePoint. So what we're saying is that we'll use the SharePoint on-premises farm to solve all of those other problems that I talked about. So SharePoint on-premises will know how to connect to all of those different kinds of systems. It will know how to manage all the authentication. So the hybrid solution that I'm going to talk about today relies on the fact that SharePoint is in both places. It's on-premises and it's in the cloud. This is one of those questions that comes up quite a lot. If you're looking at a SharePoint Online solution and you want a hybrid configuration, why do I need to have a farm on premises? And the answer is that when we were talking to customers, we found that most of our customers already had SharePoint farms on premises, and they were looking for how to take their on-premises SharePoint and extend that into the cloud, rather than saying that we're going to start from scratch, we're going to create a new tenancy in SPO, and then go from there. So we found that the majority of the customers are trying to move from on-premises into the cloud. And so what we did was we took a dependency on SharePoint on-premises being there. Now, what that means is that when SPO, when SharePoint Online calls on-premises, it actually calls SharePoint on-premises. And there needs to be something in between to let that connection go through. I've called it a reverse proxy or network appliance here. For most of this session, I'm going to talk about this box as being a reverse proxy. But there is another option, and I'm going to show that right at the end, where that box is actually moved into the cloud as well. And that's a service bus scenario where you set up what's called a relay service in the cloud. And then you don't need to have anything that's sitting in the DMZ. So I'm going to talk about that at the end of my session. But for most of this, at least the first part of my talk, I'm going to assume that there's a reverse proxy there. And I'm going to show you how to configure that into SharePoint Online. And then what we've done is, on the on-premises side, we have something that authenticates inbound connections, that knows that it's SharePoint Online that's coming in, authenticates that caller, does the identity transformation from your cloud identity to your on-premises identity, does any additional transformations to that request that are needed to call to the on-premises system, picks up any other on-premises identities or credentials that it needs to, and then makes the call to the on-premises system, and then returns the response all the way back to SharePoint Online. It needs to do some other things as well. So let's say that this pipe breaks anywhere. We also have to make sure that exceptions and error messages flow all the way back. And so there's a lot of subtleties that as we get through the presentation, we'll talk about. Now, the design is built around the S2S identity platform that was introduced in this release. If you're not familiar with S2S, I'll strongly recommend going to a talk. I think it's tomorrow. I think it's SPC140. I'll show you. My last slide has the number for the session, and that session is it's around the S2S identity platform and describes all the different configurations and the security patterns that were introduced here. But in my session, I'm just going to talk about those parts of the S2S platform that apply to the hybrid BCS and Duet scenarios. Now, the design goals for the S2S platform is it enables SharePoint to SharePoint, and it models that as an app. So when SharePoint Online calls SharePoint on-premises, SharePoint Online actually appears as an app to SharePoint on-premises, and any caller has to have what we call an app principal. So an app principal is your identity that the identity platform knows about. So the identity platform now has, it knows your tenancy in SPO has its own identity. Your on-premises SharePoint system has its own identity. When I talk about Duet Online, I'll show that SAP is modeled as an app as well. So it has its own app principal. It has an identity that the identity platform knows about. And what we've done is we've tried to make this seamless so that as identities move across these different layers, transformations occur so that the example I gave, so Peter at contoso.com gets mapped to contoso/Peter, and these transformations occur as needed, wherever needed. The other goals that we used was, we used what we call as a trust broker, and we have this system called ACS, which is an access control system, which gets provisioned. So when you create a tenancy in Office 365, ACS gets automatically provisioned for you. So what that means is that when SharePoint Online or SharePoint on-premises or Exchange or Link or any of these third-party systems like SAP needs to call one another, they all go to ACS first. They need to say who they are, so they give ACS their own app principal. They give it the app principal of who they're calling out to, and they get a security token back that enables that connection, assuming that the right set of trust has been set up. And the other goal that we had was we wanted a single system of the truth for identity. So the MSO, Microsoft Online Directory Services, MSODS, is that place. So all identities are basically synced to that. SharePoint has its own directory server, but that's something that gets synced also with the MSODS. But what that means is that MSODS is a single system that knows about identity on premises as well as in the cloud. And I'll show you how that gets set up. So what does that mean? So I want to now take a very specific example of a user, we'll call him Peter, who goes to a SharePoint page, and that SharePoint page has a query in it. So let's take an example of the page has an external data list which uses BCS to connect to data. So the first thing that happens is that SharePoint Online receives that request. BCS receives that request and then calls the security token service. The security token service calls ACS. ACS returns the security token back to BCS. And then BCS calls on-premises. On-premises will trust this call because it's come from ACS. It sees the security token that's been issued by ACS. And then it will hand the request back over to BCS that's sitting on premises. BCS is then going to make the call to the on-premises OData service and get a response back, and then send it back into the cloud. If at any point in this process, if something goes wrong, then an exception gets thrown, and regardless of whether the exception originates from the component inside SPO or on-premises, that gets packaged along with the response and goes all the way back into SPO, into BCS in SharePoint Online, and then BCS will show the appropriate error message and log the appropriate error log. So the user might see a message that says something went wrong, contact your admin, and if needed, he'll get a correlation ID, which he can then give to this admin, and then the admin can then check out the logs to see what the error message happen. And for folks who were in the session yesterday, I also showed that we've provided a way for admins to call the cloud from an on-premises system, give a correlation ID, and say, hey, my user Peter was trying to do something. He got this error. Can you send me back all the relevant logs? Because in general, logs aren't available to an on-premises admin from SharePoint Online. But what we've done is we want to make sure that if anything goes wrong, we want an admin to be able to first check to see whether the problem is on the on-premises side and can be fixed by him without having to call support or without having to call Microsoft Ops. And only if he can verify that the problem isn't something that's fixable on-premises should he call back. So we've made all of that possible. So the key points to remember is that Microsoft Online Directory Services, MSODS, is the single source of both app principals, which is the identity of all of these different players. It's a place where identity of all of users are stored. SharePoint on-premises knows about MSODS. SharePoint Online knows about the MSODS. We have a process called directory sync, which lets you take your on-premises Active Directory and basically sync all these on-premises identities into the cloud. And then as calls are originating and making its way across these different layers, we do the identity mappings as needed by looking against the directory service. And the way that the identity mapping works is it uses one of three things, either the UPN or the mail address, the SMTP address, or the SIP address that Link uses. And if any of those match up between an on-premises user and a cloud user, it will know that these users are the same. So I'm not going to spend much time around that. But again, for folks who want more information on this space, there's a talk tomorrow, SPC218, that will go into this in a lot more detail. Now, from a BCS perspective, the key points to remember are that when we ship BCS in prior releases, we have this concept of a BCS model that describes both the shape of the data, so it lets you specify which operations you can call to create requests or read requests, update, all the CRUD key operations. So it defines not just the shape of the data, but also defines the connection properties and the security and authentication, all of that. What we did was in this release, we split those into two. So we've said that although the models that worked in 14 will continue to work, we've also added a way for you to specify separately the connection settings, which define the connection properties and the security properties, from the part of the model that defines the shape of the data. And what we're saying is that a tenant admin can go in and manage these connection setting properties separate from the model. And also, in order to set up one of these hybrid connections, you need to be a tenant admin. These connections can be scoped either to across a tenancy or to within an app. And if you write an app that uses an app scope BCS connection, you can take the same app and you can transport it from on-premises to the cloud or vice versa, and the app won't change because all that changes when you move an app from one environment to the other is the connection settings. And when I start showing you the demos in a moment, you're going to see all of that. So now let's talk about how that configuration is done. So I'm going to show you the first of my demos, which is how I can configure a BCS connection to on-premises data. And there are three steps, broadly. So first of all, I need to set up the certificate that the reverse proxy will use. So when I showed you the block diagram of the design for all the different components of how this hybrid architecture is put together, one thing that I mentioned was that as Contoso, you need a way for your tenancy in Office 365 to be able to tell a reverse proxy that this is a trusted tenancy. And the way we do that is by using SSL client certificates. And so the first part of the demo will be showing you how you can store your SSL client certificate inside SPO for use by BCS. Once you've done that, I'm going to show you how to configure some connections for on-premises endpoints. And then finally, I'll show you how that connection is used. So this is the demo for the first step. So what you'll do is you need to go to your admin portal for SharePoint Online. You click on the left for Secure Store. And Secure Store, for those folks who don't know about it, is the service that SharePoint uses, both on-premises as well as online, for managing and storing credentials securely. So all credentials are encrypted. There's no way for anybody to get into that database and see a credential. A tenant admin can go and set a credential or model credentials, but he can't actually see anything that's there. So you go to Secure Store. You say that you want to edit or create a new kind of credential, and in this case, it's a certificate. So if you look at the field types, you'll see that this credential has a certificate type and it comes with a password. And you say OK. So now you have a proxy cert that's sitting in your Secure Store. You can also go in and you can set the credential by clicking on set, and you can upload a certificate here, and you can provide the certificate password. And if you do that, then you now have a certificate that SharePoint Online knows about. At this point, we haven't really done much with it. All we've told SPO is that I have a certificate, and it's called Proxy Cert. Next, I go to the BCS section of the SharePoint Online or Admin Center. I click on that, and I have 3 different things here. The first thing is I can manage BDC models and external content types. This is the same BCS configuration that existed in SharePoint 2010. So if you go to the farm admin console for SharePoint 2010, you can click on this and do that. What we added in this release was the ability to separately model connection settings. So I'm going to click on the connection settings to on-premises data. And then that brings me to the second part of my demo, where I'm going to configure a connection setting to an on-premises service. I'm going to show you the configuration for something called CRM app. So that's a CRM application that somebody wrote and deployed in SharePoint Online. And if you look at the properties, you can see that it knows about the on-premises URL that it's connecting to. It knows about the internet-facing URL, the reverse proxy URL that it needs to go through. It has different authentication options. Now, in this simplistic case, we didn't use any authentication to the on-premises system, this service, but we have different options. So you can go in and you can change this. So the first option is you can use your user's identity. What this means is that we will use single sign-on. So when SharePoint Online calls SharePoint on-premises, your identity will be taken down to SharePoint, to the SharePoint farm on-premises, and then SharePoint on-premises is going to use the same identity to call your on-premises system, OData system. Now, depending on the configuration you use, if you use Windows authentication, that will require you to have Kerberos configured because it's a double hop problem that I won't talk about. But this is, in this case, you need Kerberos. If you go to the second option, this will let you do basic auth over SSL. And in this case, what we'll do is we'll take the credentials that are configured in the Secure Store service that are in SharePoint on-premises. So as I said at the beginning, we don't store any credentials in the cloud, but your credentials are stored on-prem. And SharePoint on-prem is going to do that job for us, where it's going to extract the credentials out from its own local on-premises Secure Store and pass them to the OData service. The last option is the use OData extension provider, which is this one. And this lets you specify a custom authentication provider. So let's say that you want to do something that's custom. So that custom thing might be that the OData service that you're trying to connect to on-premises has a custom HTTP module, or it's looking for a magic auth header, or some other kind of header. You can actually configure that in this custom provider. And when I do the next demo, I'm going to show a use of that, because that's how we connect to SAP. And then you have different ways of setting that up, and those are the authentication modes. So again, for this simple case, the CRM app, we didn't actually use authentication, and I'll show you in the next demo a more complicated authentication scenario. So the other thing that you can optionally do, this is not a required step, is you can go to a connection and you can specify any additional metadata properties. Now, by default, the metadata address for your service will be your service URL, and on the end of it over here will be a dollar metadata. And the reason that we do that is because that's by default what the OData protocol prescribes. However, we've seen cases where either the metadata protocol URL is different or the authentication that the metadata service offers is different. And so we let you either use the same authentication as the service URL or specify a different way of authenticating. And if you do that, then the connection is ready to use. And so I'm going to show the third case. Here what I have is I have a SharePoint site. And on the left, I have an app that somebody wrote called a CRM app. It's a very basic app that shows a list of customers. And when I drill into that app, it's an immersive app that takes over your screen. It's not the prettiest of apps, but it's illustrated to show that if I click on populate customers, I get a list of customers. Now, what's happened is that this app is running in SharePoint Online. It's used the connection I showed you in the second part of the demo, and it retrieved the list of customers from that on-premises system. If you want more information on how you can write an app that uses BCS, I covered that in my session yesterday, including a demo where I used Visual Studio to create the app. So this is an app that somebody used Visual Studio, connected to the OData service, used basically just HTML and JavaScript and created this. And it can be as fancy or you can customize it as much as you want. So that's the first demo. Now I'm going to show you the same thing but a little more complicated. I'm going to show you how the connection, you can configure that to an on-premises SAP system. So for SAP, things get a little more complicated. So there are 3 different authentication systems that are required here. So just as I said in the first case, there's a token that you need to get from ACS, so that's this red token. This gets passed to the reverse proxy, but in addition, it also uses the SSL client certificate that it pulls out of Secure Store. And it uses the SSL client certificate to authenticate to the reverse proxy. It uses the OAuth token from ACS to authenticate to SharePoint on-premises. BCS here now uses a Duet component that has a custom extension provider to talk to SAP. So if I look at the configuration, I'll show you where that custom extension provider is configured. So now let's look at that. So for this part of the demo, I'm going to show you 3 different steps. The first step is where you configure Duet. Then I'm going to show you the BCS models that are automatically provisioned when you configure Duet. And then I'm going to show you how the connection settings for the SAP OData service endpoints are configured. So step 1 is Duet configuration. So for those customers who sign up for an Office 365 tenancy, when you go to your tenant admin page, you'll see a set of things on your left. And what you won't see, that you see on the screen, is this link that says Duet Enterprise. In order to get Duet Enterprise, you need to sign up for an offer. It's an add-on to SharePoint Online. And if you sign up for the add-on, then you will see this link. And if you click on Duet Enterprise, you'll see 3 different things that you can do. One is you can manage connections to SAP. Second is you can manage various security settings. And the third is you can configure roles, the role sync that I talked about. So if you click on the Manage Connections, what it will do is it will show you how to configure the connections for various Duet features. So this is the connection for workflow, integrated workflow with SAP. This is the connection to reporting, and this is the connection that uses for role sync. What you'll see is that these are just names. If I look at the drop-down, I'll see a list of names that I can select from. And these connections are configured in the second step. So I'm going to show you that in a second. The other thing you can do is you can configure the security. So as I said, that the identity platform is what ties all the different components together. The identity platform is also the thing that gives each of these guys an identity, an app principal. And so when you sign up for Duet, you'll see the first time you'll see a link which says get an identifier. You click on that, and ACS will issue an identifier as well as a secret. So this is like a username and a password. And this is the combination of credentials that will need to be configured on the SAP side as well. So you're going to take these credentials, give them from the SharePoint admin, will give them to the SAP admin, and they'll use that to establish the connection. Okay. There are a few other things that you configure. I'm not going to talk through all of them. But if you have any specific questions, feel free to ping me afterwards. So once you do that, you've configured connections. You selected from a set of connections, and you've configured the credentials for the ACS. But you still have to set up the credentials yourselves. And this step is done before. So if you go to BCS, what you can do is you can click on the first part, the Manage BDC Models, and you'll see a set of BDC models. So these are models that have automatically been provisioned for you. I'm not going to go through the details of these. All I'm going to say is that when we turn Duet on for your Office 365 tenancy, a bunch of configuration happened behind the scenes, and that resulted in a set of BCS models that got automatically provisioned for you. And if you want, you can take a look at them, and you can look at the different models and the external content types and the external systems. But you don't have to do that. This is something that Duet will automatically take care of for you. So this is just the different configuration properties. I'm going to skip those in the interest of time. And I'm going to the third part, which is the models themselves. As I said, just define the shape of the data. For Duet, it's an integration that we built, so we know what the data looks like. We know that a workflow task looks like this, and SAP knows that, and so we're good. The BCS model describes that, and that was the part that got automatically provisioned. What we don't know is that in your environment, in a customer environment, what that endpoint actually is, and what the actual service URL is. And so that you have to go over to so I'm backing up a second. You go back and you set up a connection settings. So you click on that, you find the connection settings for reporting and workflow. You can go to the properties, and just like in the previous screen, you can see the different properties. So this shows you the service URL for SAP, and it also shows you the thing that is different for SAP is that there's an extension provider here, and this is an extension provider that runs on premises. And when SharePoint Online calls on premises, and SharePoint on premises is trying to call SAP, this extension provider kicks in, and it adds something to the request that lets that request get authenticated to SAP. In this case, what we did was we set up an extension provider that dynamically generates client cert and attaches that to the request. And SAP knows how to trust that client certificate. And once that happens, then the call is able to get through to SAP. And you see that we've also configured the reverse proxy's client certificate as well. And once you do that, you've set up the connection settings that Duet will use to connect to SAP. So I'm just showing you that the metadata is the same. So I'm not going to go through that. Now, once you do that, so at this point what you have is you've set up a tenancy in Office 365. The Office 365 tenancy now knows that you have an SAP on premises. Connection has been established, and you now want to use that connection. So I'm going to show you a couple of different scenarios. The first scenario is where you receive a report in SharePoint Online from on-premises SAP. Now, before I show you the demo, the key question that we need to answer is, how does an on-premises SAP system authenticate to SPO? And just as I talked about in the first part, this is all based on the S2S protocols of the identity platform. It's an extension to OAuth 2.0. We couldn't use OAuth out of the box because the specification isn't fully there. There's a bunch of things that are not finalized. And so what we did was we went with what we call an OAuth 2.0-like authentication scheme. We've documented it fully, and these are links that basically point to MSD and articles that document the schema itself. And so what we did was we used the S2S protocol for modeling SAP in the Duet scenario, and SAP is modeled as an app. It has an app principal in ACS. ACS can identify SAP as a distinct entity using that principle. We establish trust. So there are three players in this system. This SharePoint Online, this SharePoint on-premises, and this SAP on-premises. And all three of these things trust each other. The way that trust is established with SAP is we use certificate, and as part of the configuration on the SAP side, there's a certificate exchange. And then at runtime, SAP requests security tokens from ACS and uses these to authenticate to REST interfaces in SharePoint Online. So that's what this looks like. Now, SAP needs to make a call back to SharePoint Online. So SAP will call ACS, get back a security token, and call SharePoint Online with that security token. Okay, so it's very similar to the forward flow, but this is what we call the reverse flow, because instead of SharePoint Online calling an on-premises system, here the on-premises system is calling back using the token that ACS is provided in. So now let's look at the actual the user experience. So this is an app that we don't ship. What we ship is we ship a SharePoint feature that leverages the Duet connections that you set up to integrate reporting across SharePoint and SAP. However, in this case, what somebody's done is he's written an app that uses the SharePoint feature and puts a UI around it. And so what that does is you can go here, you can click on your list of templates, and here you can see that we have 5 templates of SAP has different kinds of reports. So if this was a full-fledged SAP system, you would see BI reports, ELV reports. In this case, we've configured 5 ELV reports. So he clicks on that. And what he does is he sees the 5 reports that have been set up in the system. And then he can run a report. And when he does that, he gets basically a form that lets him configure properties. I'm not going to show you all of the properties here, but this will let you essentially construct a query, a report query with properties if you want. It also integrates to help content. So if you click on the show description for this report setting, it's actually pulling help content from the on-premises SAP system and showing that here. And you close that and you run it. Now, at this point, SharePoint Online used a forward flow to call SAP and say, hey, this user is requesting a report. SAP acknowledges that, and then this is asynchronous, so a little later, the report will get delivered, and you can click on download. So if you download it, you have to authenticate to basically Office if you haven't done that. And when you sign in, you'll be able to see a report. This is not a very fancy one, we just configured an Excel file. But you can do other kinds of reports with this. So this just shows you the user experience, and it's all hybrid. So the call, when the user requested the report, that was a hybrid call from SPO to an on-premises SAP system. When SAP sent the report back, that was a hybrid call from SAP on-premises to SharePoint Online. When I clicked on that button to see help, at that point, I got help content from the on-premises SAP system. It's all happening for you in real time. So that's the thing. Now, that's the end of the reporting demo. I'm going to show you a quick demo on workflow tasks. So the reporting demo that I showed was on demand. So a user went and asked for SAP to send a report. In the workflow scenario, it's a batch scenario. So SAP sends a bunch of tasks to SharePoint Online. And what we do is we turn those into SharePoint tasks, and then a user can act on those. And then so for example, user might accept or reject. So SAP might send a task to SharePoint and say, can you approve this purchase order? Or can you approve this leave request? And whoever gets this task assigned to him will have to say accept or reject. And that result is sent back to SAP. So again, what we do with Duet is we don't provide a rich out-of-the-box experience. We provide a feature that you can build an app around. And so here you see the list of tasks. This is an app that somebody wrote. you can accept it. When you do that, the action was performed. And the other cool thing is if we sync up tasks from an on-premises system, you can actually go to your My Sites. If you go to your My Site, you now see a list of tasks across your SharePoint farm. So this is something that in the past we haven't been able to do, neither on-premises nor online, because tasks are basically constrained by the boundary of a site collection. In this version of SharePoint, what we did is the project team built a feature that uses search to actually crawl all the tasks in your content DB for SharePoint and presents them to you in your My Sites. If you click on tasks, you can see all your tasks in SharePoint, but the cool thing is you also see the tasks that you might have received from SAP. And so if you click on one of these, you see the SAP form. This is not customized. You can customize the expense to be whatever you want, but this is the default SAP form that Duet provides. And then you can go ahead and you can accept or reject. And now if you go back to your My Tasks, for some of these kinds of tasks, and the one I'm going to show you next, you also have a few other things you can do. So this is you see here a document. So if this was an invoice approval, you might have seen the invoice. Or if this is a PO, you might see a document that's a PO. So SAP has a way of attaching document attachments. If you click on this, this is something where we don't have much. So you click on the link, all it says is, hey, it's not a very fancy document, but just illustrates the point. And you can also click on this link to reassign the task, and if you do that, it gets reassigned to the non-premises user. Reassigned to another user. Now, one of the tricky things that we had to do here because of the hybrid call was we had to do identity transformations at multiple locations. So one is when we called from SharePoint Online to on-premises, we had to transform from the cloud identity to the on-premises identity. When SAP on-premises sent a request back to the cloud and said, assign this task to user Peter, we had to transform that user Peter from Redmond/Peter to Peter at Microsoft. So we had to make a transformation of the recipient of the task. And also, when you reassign the task, again, we had to do a lookup of on-premises user, and we had to do more identity transformation there. So there's actually 3 different places in the workflow, in this flow, where we're transforming users. So the next demo, I want to keep this one short, is just the last configuration option for Duet is around role sync. So if I go back to my Duet admin page, I click on configure. I've already shown you the manage connections and manage security. I can now click on manage roles authorization. And what this is it's a task. It's kind of like a timer job that runs in SharePoint Online and periodically syncs user roles from on-premises SAP system and pulls that into the cloud. And you can configure when that timer job is run for your tenancy. And also, if there's a failure, it'll show you what the last run status is and the correlation ID. So then, as I mentioned, we provided a tool I showed in yesterday's session where an admin can use that tool to retrieve log messages. So you can see the correlation ID. You can use that as a PowerShell command, and you can use that to get any error message down from SharePoint Online. You can also configure this to either do an incremental sync, in which case only the roles that have changed since the last run get synced from on-premises to cloud, or you can configure it to do a full sync if you think that those two things are not fully in sync anymore. This is the last section of my presentation, so I'm almost done here. What I'm going to talk about very briefly is I showed you 2 sets of demos. One is the SAP demo that I showed you. I showed you reports and workflows. All of that was actually going through a reverse proxy that we'd configured. And when I talked about the design at the beginning, I talked about having the reverse proxy in the DMZ. But we also have a developer scenario where instead of using reverse proxy, you don't need to change anything in the DMZ, but you can configure service bus to be a relay service in the cloud. And if you do that, then when SharePoint Online makes a call, everything remains the same. The configuration remains the same. It makes the call instead of to the reverse proxy, it calls the relay service. You still use an SSL client certificate to authenticate yourself to this. And then you need to set up a relay agent that's on premises. And this uses Azure Service Bus. And so when this makes the call, this knows how to connect to on-premises. And the way that does is it uses a technique called long polling to do that. But if you use the service bus, this is automatically taken care of for you. And then this will call SharePoint and connect to SAP. So in fact, the demo I showed you for the simple CRM app was actually provisioned in this way, where we used the service bus and we didn't change the DMZ. Now, what we recommend is to use a reverse proxy, not a service bus, for this scenario, because that's something that we've tested and we know the performance characteristics of. If you want to use a service bus, you can do that. It is certainly a supported scenario as a developer scenario, but then you need to also take care of things like the performance characteristics and the load, and depending on how many service buses you configure and your own scenario, your usage scenario. So that's just a quick overview of what is possible here. So I just wanted to call out that there are some other sessions that cover this topic. I'm going to stop here and just take questions, and feel free to ask me anything you want. But if you want to have more information, the first session is the one that I'd recommend strongly, which is the session on the S2S identity platform, and that describes in much more greater detail how some of these S2S flows are configured. So with that, any questions that you might have? Sure. Okay, so the question is, are there any changes in model structure, this BCS model structure, to set up these kind of hybrid flows, and what is the tooling available? So there's two parts to that. First is, any SharePoint model that you create in the previous release, BCS, will continue to work in this version of BCS. So we haven't taken anything away. However, if you want to create a hybrid flow, you will need to separate out the connection properties from the BCS model and put them in this connection settings that I showed you the configuration for. We've also, in this release, extended Visual Studio. So I showed that in yesterday's session, where I took VS, I connected it to an OData service, and I created an app. You can take that app and deploy it, and all of that tooling is new. And what that means is that a developer can build an app. He doesn't care about how it's going to get provisioned. He doesn't need to know the connection settings. None of that's going to get hard-coded into his app, neither the connection string itself or the credentials. He can hand that over to the admin. The admin has to bless it. So there's in yesterday's session, when I showed the provisioning, the actual deployment of the app, I showed where, as part of the deployment flow, an admin had to basically trust that app. And so all of that is possible. So yes is tooling, and yes is a process to separate development from configuration. Sure. How do you get a what? Okay. So the question is, how do you get Duet Enterprise? So if you go to the partner booth downstairs, there's a booth that's been set up by SAP, and you can talk to them, and they'll help you get it set up. Okay. Sure. Okay, that's the question is, in these hybrid flows, the correlation ID that's on premises and online, how do you manage that? And that's a great question. What we do is, if you try something in BCS and an error is thrown, so for example, let's say that let's say that the error is thrown online, so you incorrectly configure the reverse proxy, so you'll get the correlation ID that's generated online. Let's suppose now the call actually made it to on-premises, and an error occurred there. Then a correlation ID is generated on-premises, and we will actually send that back along with the exception, and you will have the on-premises correlation ID online. And so that's what we do. We package the error message as well as the collision ID from on-premises. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I guess that's it.